Hello there. It's another time for another basic science lesson, and today we will be continuing in our study on the human organ system. Now today we'll be looking at the human respiratory system. Now the objectives of this lesson is to help learners to define respiration and describe the human respiratory system, to help learners describe the two types of respiration, to help learners differentiate between the two types of the human respiratory system, to help learners describe the structure and mechanism of the respiratory system, and finally to describe the process of breathing. Now moving along, we'll be looking at the human respiratory system. We'll be describing it. Now the human respiratory system consists of a number of organs which work together to ensure the supply of oxygen to the body cells and the removal of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide from the cells. The respiratory organ include the nose, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the lungs. Now the process of respiration itself is the release of energy as a result of the breakdown of glucose for the body's use. Oxygen taken into the lungs from the air is carried through the circulatory system to different cells where they are used to break down the glucose to produce energy. So you can see right here, this is the general overview or picture showing the human respiratory system, showing its parts. So you can see right here, you have the nasal cavity, the alveoli, the bronchus, the bronchioles, the diaphragm, rib cage, lungs, trachea. All these form the human respiratory system. Now moving along, we'll be looking at the types of respiration. Basically, we have two types of respiration. We have the anaerobic respiration and the aerobic respiration. Now from the pictures that we see here, it describes the two processes. Now aerobic respiration is a type of respiration which requires oxygen to take place. Now in aerobic respiration, the glucose is broken down in the presence of oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water vapor, which are byproducts of respiration, while the energy produced is what the cells use to carry out the cellular activities, whereas the carbon dioxide here and water is given off as exhaled air. The oxygen that is used in aerobic respiration is gotten from the process of breathing in, while the carbon dioxide and water vapor are released out of the body through breathing out or the process of exhalation. So this is aerobic respiration, the breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen to produce carbon dioxide, water vapor, and energy in form of ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, which the cell needs to carry out the cellular activity. But in the case of anaerobic respiration, the major difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration is that there is no glucose is not required to break down oxygen is not required to break down glucose to form energy. As you can see right here, you can see that in this anaerobic respiration equation, we are not using any any oxygen at all to break down glucose to form energy. Now in the case of anaerobic respiration can take place in form of lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. Now the process of anaerobic respiration in which lactic acid is produced can be found in animals, especially in the muscles, when the muscles has been overworked and it is stressed up or fatigued. Then the only way that they can get energy is through the breakdown of glucose to form lactic acid, which in some cases produce what we call muscle pull. It causes tightening of the muscles due to the accumulation of the lactic acid. So this is the lactic acid fermentation that happens in animals, especially in the muscles of human beings. But alcoholic fermentation usually happens in yeast, especially in plants. An example is yeast, in which glucose is broken down to form ethanol, which is a form of alcohol, carbon dioxide, and energy. The carbon dioxide is given off, and ethanol is the product of alcoholic fermentation. Is another form of anaerobic respiration that takes place in plants. But overall, in anaerobic respiration, we don't need oxygen for anaerobic respiration to take place, but aerobic respiration requires oxygen. Now, moving along, we'll be looking at the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. In aerobic respiration, the process is the breakdown of food in the presence of oxygen, while in anaerobic respiration, it is the process of breakdown of food in the absence of oxygen. One other difference is that the end product of aerobic respiration is carbon dioxide and water, while the end product of anaerobic respiration can be lactic acid or carbon dioxide and alcohol, as we saw in the previous slide in that equation. Another difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration is that in aerobic respiration, it takes longer time to release energy, whereas in anaerobic respiration, it is a fast process as compared to aerobic respiration. In aerobic respiration, large amount of energy is produced, while in anaerobic respiration, only small amount of energy is produced as compared to aerobic respiration. And finally, in aerobic respiration, it occurs mostly in plants and animals, while anaerobic respiration occurs in yeast, bacteria, human muscular cells or human muscle cells, and so on. So these are the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Now, moving on, we'll be looking at the structure and mechanism of human respiratory system. Now, as you saw in the first slide, the respiratory system, especially which is responsible for the exchange of gases, you can see that air enters through the nasal cavity when we breathe in air, and that air goes down to the pharynx that you see right here, and down to the larynx, and from the larynx to the trachea. As you can see here, this is the long tube which splits into two parts called the bronchus, while two of them, plural, is called the bronchi, and the bronchi branches out into what we call the bronchioles. And once air goes into the bronchioles, it goes at the end of each bronchiole you have the air sac, or what we call the alveoli. Now, this is what the alveoli looks like. The alveoli, is wrapped around by capillaries, which aid in the exchange of gases. So once the oxygen enters in through the nose and gets to the alveoli, the oxygen diffuses into the blood capillaries, while the carbon dioxide from the blood goes from the blood vessel into the alveoli, and from the alveoli it goes to the bronchioles. From the bronchioles it goes through the bronchi, from the bronchi to the trachea, from the trachea out of the nose. So breathing in takes in oxygen, the body takes in oxygen, while breathing out, the carbon dioxide from which diffuses from the blood vessels into the alveoli goes back out through the nostril. So you can see this picture right here shows gaseous exchange between the alveoli and the capillaries. Now you can see the blood vessels surrounds the alveoli. So as air comes in form of oxygen, as air comes in and enters into the alveoli, the oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells. So you can see that the red blood cells has different colors. So once oxygen enters into it, it changes the color of the red blood cells. So the blood now becomes oxygenated, whereas the waste product, which is carbon dioxide, diffuses out of the blood into the alveolus, and it moves out, and we breathe it out in form of exhaled air. So this is how the respiratory system works. Now, moving on, we'll be looking at the process of breathing, or the breathing movement. There are two breathing movements, inspiration and expiration. Breathing in is called inspiration, while breathing out is called expiration. Now, what happens during inspiration? During inspiration, the external intercostal muscles contract, and the ribs move upwards and outwards. If you try to breathe in, you can actually feel, your rib cage, coming outwards and upwards. The muscles of the diaphragm contract, pulling it down into a flatter position. These actions increase the volume of the chest and reduce the pressure of air inside it. Therefore, air rushes in through the trachea and bronchi from outside the body. It is pushed in by the pressure of the air outside the body. Now we're going to see a pictorial representation of inspiration. Now expiration. During expiration, the external intercostal muscles relax and the ribs fall back into their original position. The muscle fibers in the diaphragm relax and it rises to its dome-shaped position again. As the volume of the chest decreases, the pressure of the air inside it increases and the air is pushed to the outside through the air passages. Now this is the pictorial representation of what I just described in the previous slide. Now as you can see here, as air goes in, the chest cavity expands. The rib cage comes outward and upwards, and the diaphragm contracts or flattens out. As you can see, the diaphragm here flattens out. The chest cavity comes outward and upwards, and the lungs fill up with air. The volume of the lungs increases while the pressure reduces. But during exhalation, when air comes out of the body, as you can see, the chest cavity decreases in volume. In other words, the lungs, the volume in the lungs decreases while the pressure within it forces the air out of the lungs, and the chest cavity returns back inward and downwards. As you can see that the diaphragm relaxes, returning to its dome shape. So this is what we described in the previous slide, as you can see it in this picture for yourself. Now this brings us to the end of our lesson on the human respiratory system. Now let's take a quick look at the summary. The human respiratory system consists of a number of organs which work together to ensure the supply of oxygen to the body cells and the removal of carbon dioxide from the cells. Respiratory organs include the nose, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, which are located in the lungs. Respiration is the release of energy as a result of the breakdown of glucose for the body's use. There are two types of respiration, namely aerobic and anaerobic respiration. There are two breathing movements, inspiration and expiration. Breathing in is called inspiration, while breathing out is called expiration. Now we have come to the end of our lesson on the human respiratory system. Now I want to pause this video and endeavor to answer the questions in this assessment to see how much of the lessons that you have imbibed, and I will see you again in the next lesson.